Hi, I'm Alan Thurston, author of It Ain't So, Shoeless Joe Jackson's Story, which consists of a two-act play and an afterword, where I attempt to the best of my ability to make the case for Shoeless Joe Jackson. This is part 5 of my video presentation. Shoeless Joe Jackson sued White Sox owner Charles Comiskey for the back pay he believed he was owed from the 3-year contract he signed in 1920. The civil trial took place in January and February of 1924 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. How excited Joe must have been that he was finally getting the chance to tell the world his story, and not the one I believe he was coached to tell the Cook County grand jury on September 28, 1920, by Comiskey's counsel, Alfred Austrian. Austrian testified that he had told Jackson when he came to his office prior to his grand jury appearance that he needed a lawyer damn bad. Shoeless Joe said Austrian told him that he could do him more good than any attorney that he might hire. After coaching the ball player for 2 to 3 hours, Austrian rushed Joe to the grand jury room so that he could testify before the jury adjourned for the day. As one of Jackson's lawyers at the civil trial, James Shaw, brought out during his cross-examination, Austrian didn't want Jackson to have the opportunity to hire an attorney who would represent his interests and not those of Comiskey. William Lamb, in his article, An Ever-Changing Story, writes, Jackson, quote, along with teammates Eddie Seacott and Lefty Williams, abjectly admitted that he had agreed to join the conspiracy to throw the series in return for a gambler's payoff. But once in the hands of experienced legal counsel, Joe's story changed, end quote. Clearly implying to me that Joe's attorney coached him to lie during the 1924 civil trial. We who support Joe believe it was Austrian who coached the baseball star to lie, to make a false confession during his 1920 grand jury testimony. Wouldn't anyone involved in a legal case prefer to be advised by an experienced attorney representing their interests rather than a lawyer representing those of their adversary, in this case, Charles Comiskey? Austrian's sole goal was to convince Joe, who had it within his power to take down the White Sox owner by exposing the Comiskey cover-up of the fix, that it was to his advantage to confess his guilt, since, as I had mentioned previously in part 3 of my video presentation, no judge or jury would believe his protestations of innocence. Seacott had implicated him, and he had taken the bribe money, put it in the bank, and made withdrawals. So he could be charged with perjury if he insisted he was innocent. If he wanted to stay out of jail, he would need the help of the White Sox management. He must not implicate Comiskey if he wanted their help. When he testified during his civil trial, Jackson claimed that he had argued with Lefty Williams when he offered him the bribe money, when he was offered the bribe money by Williams, and that he told the Southpaw he had some nerve using his name with the gamblers without his permission, that he took the bribe to Comiskey's office to show the owner the money and had the door slammed in his face, that he had written Comiskey a letter a month after the 1919 World Series ended, offering to return to Chicago to tell what he knew and clear his name, and Comiskey never responded. That he had told Harry Grabner that he had received $5,000 from Williams, and the White Sox team secretary told him that he could keep the money. Lamb writes that, quote, Joe's direct examination drew favorable press reviews, end quote. The Milwaukee Sentinel reported on January 30th, 1924, quote, Jackson made an excellent witness. He looked well on the stand. His answers came quickly and clearly. However, the cheers turned to jeers after Shoeless Joe, during his cross-examination by Comiskey's civil trial attorney, George Hudnall, when Joe denied much of what he had testified to before the Cook County grand jury 3.5 years before. Dr. David Fletcher stated on the Catching the Wave podcast that, quote, Comiskey's attorney Hudnall contacted the state's attorney's office in Cook County. He got copies of the grand jury transcripts, and he brilliantly used those when he deposed Lefty Williams and Eddie Seacott. He just basically asked them questions about their prior testimony and what he did And when he did Joe Jackson's pretrial civil deposition in Georgia in April of 1923, he held it in the weeds. He didn't bring up Joe Jackson's grand jury testimony. He just held back on that, so that was his strategy. So in the cross-examination, Hudnall pulls out the grand jury testimony and basically impeaches Shoeless Joe, end quote. William Lamb writes, quote, "One of the many fabrications that mar enjoyment of Elliot Asanoff's popular treatment of the Black Sox scandal in his book 8 Men Out is the assertion that the grand jury testimony had been lost and that Joe was ambushed when the transcript suddenly appeared from Comiskey attorney Hudnall's briefcase. The claim is absurd." Lamb further has written, quote, nor was Jackson's side surprised by Hudnall's possession of the grand jury transcript. Joe's attorney Raymond Cannon, having made a motion to preclude the transcript's use at the civil trial, that motion was denied by Judge Gregory, end quote. During the Northern New England chapter Zoom meeting, Jacob Pomranke, the current chairman of the Sabre Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, said, quote, "By 1924, Joe's story changes a lot, and when he is confronted with his old grand jury testimony, Comiskey's lawyers were asking him, 'Did you make this answer?' And over 100 times Jackson said no. I was not asked that question, and I did not make that answer, including very damning questions. Did anyone pay you any money to help throw the World Series?" And his answer in 1920 was yes, they did. And in 1924, he said, "No, I never said that," refuting his old grand jury testimony, end quote. The late Jerome Holtzman, who was, during his life, the foremost Shoeless Joe Jackson detractor, wrote, quote, "Joe is recanting, changing his story," end quote. When one recants a false confession, whether it occurs in such high-profile cases as the Central Park Five or Amanda Knox case, or much lower-profile cases, one changes his or her story. A recantation of a false confession is, by definition, a change of story. Gene Carney, founder and first chairman of the Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, observed that at Shoeless Joe's civil trial, quote, "The fact that he had repudiated his grand jury testimony was never made clear to the jury. His lawyers' requests for copies of the grand jury documents were sidestepped," end quote. Joe's attorneys, Raymond Cannon and James Shaw, requested a copy of his grand jury transcript several times, but Comiskey's lawyer, Hudnall, did not provide them with one until the middle of the 1924 civil trial, which was obviously much too late. Shoeless Joe was, therefore, ambushed by Comiskey's attorney, Hudnall. It may not have been in as melodramatic a fashion as was described in Asanoff's book, 8 Men Out, but he was clearly ambushed. According to AEI Overview, quote, "Trial by ambush was a practice that Wisconsin law actively sought to eliminate in the 1920s, when formal discovery rules, as they are known today, did not exist. A reform movement was underway to ensure fairness and to prevent surprise at trial. Discovery rules exist in law to promote fairness, preventing one side in a legal dispute from having unfair advantage by withholding crucial evidence, ensuring parties are not caught off guard. Legal discovery is a pre-trial practice designed to prevent trial by ambush and includes requests for production of all relevant documents." Trial by ambush, and what was more relevant in this case than Joe Jackson's grand jury testimony? And they were denied access to that crucial document. Trial by ambush is considered unfair because it gives one party a surprise advantage by withholding evidence until the last moment, violating principles of fairness. It violates the fundamental principles of due process, which requires that all parties have a fair opportunity to present their case and respond to the evidence against them. Knowing what evidence to expect allows each side to prepare their response, gather any necessary counter-evidence, and develop their case strategy, preventing surprise tactics at trial, and as a result, promoting a fair trial. Starting around 1905, legal reformers in Wisconsin, and Joe's civil trial, was held in Wisconsin, led by figures like Chief Justice John Winslow, made a concentrated effort to eliminate what was known as, quote, the sporting theory of justice, end quote, a term used to criticize the outdated practice of treating a lawsuit as a game, where lawyers focus on using procedural rules to gain an advantage and surprise their opponents, rather than cooperating to seek the truth. Case tenets of the sporting theory include 1. Adversarial focus, where the primary goal is to win the legal contest using strategy, much like a professional football coach, rather than to help the court find truth and justice. 2. Surprise elements, when parties aim to keep key information hidden to surprise their adversary rather than to engage in open disclosure. The adoption of modern rules of civil procedure, particularly the broad and liberal discovery rules and the United States Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, was explicitly designed to eliminate the sporting theory of litigation. Modern Wisconsin courts have explicitly stated that the state, quote, has abandoned the concept of trial by ambush, end quote. The modern system promotes open and liberal discovery, requiring parties to reveal all pertinent non-privileged information to one another before trial. This transparency is designed to eliminate the element of surprise. The Wisconsin Rules of Civil Procedure are designed to prevent trial by ambush, including process where parties exchange documents, promoting a fair and level playing field. That was not in effect in 1924 during Shoeless Joe's civil trial. And because of that, Comiskey's attorney Hudnall was able to get away with withholding Joe's grand jury transcript from Jackson's attorneys. That led to Shoeless Joe being ambushed on the stand by George Hudnall. Joe's detractors may say that by modern standards it was unfortunate, but that is just the way the Wisconsin legal system operated in those days. To which I would say, that's right, but it ain't right. It ain't fair. It's not fair, and it's another reason Shakespeare's line, quote, let's kill all the lawyers, end quote, resonates with so many. As I have indicated, many in the 1920s recognized that trial by ambush was unfair and should be done away with, as it eventually was by rules of discovery. Jacob Pomranke stated during the Catching the Wave podcast, Joe's lawyer could have helped him out a little bit, more and prepped him for that old grand jury testimony. That was the fatal flaw in this case, for Joe Jackson was not being prepped to being presented with his own grand jury testimony. I'll repeat that. That was the fatal flaw in this case, for Joe Jackson was not being prepped to being presented with his own grand jury testimony, end quote. How could his attorneys prep Jackson if they were denied a copy of his grand jury testimony? The civil trial transcript is rife with Joe's lawyers' quotes about their frustration at being denied access to his grand jury transcript so they could prep him. Cannon and Shaw complained, quote, we had no opportunity to examine the grand jury records. They also complained, quote, our effort to secure a copy of the grand jury records has been futile, end quote. James Shaw stated during his interrogation of Albert Allen, the court stenographer who transcribed Jackson's testimony, quote, Mr. Hudnall never gave me a copy and never offered to give me one. When we made inquiry as to how you get a copy of the grand jury record, no suggestion was made that it was open to us, end quote. Shaw asked the court stenographer, question, you never made but one transcript? Allen answered, no, sir. Question, and you delivered the transcript that you made to the state's attorney? Answer, yes, sir. Question, no one else could make a transcript from your notes, could they? Answer, no, they couldn't. Question, no one else could read your notes. Answer, I don't think so. Question, no transcript has been made since. No transcript has been made since. Answer, no, sir. So only one copy of the grand jury transcript existed, and Hudnall had it. Mr. Shaw declared, quote, no copy was ever offered to me, and none was ever offered to Mr. Cannon in my presence. Hudnall alleged, I have a copy here, and I think I stated the other day that I had a copy and offered it. Not that I had a copy and offered it to them to follow while I was reading it to Mr. Jackson. Mr. Shaw responded that that was, quote, wholly untrue, unquote. Also, it would not have done them much good if Hudnall offered them a copy when Hudnall had Jackson on the stand, since they were denied the opportunity to prep their client. Jackson's attorneys also complained that they had not been given a copy of the Seacott and Williams grand jury transcripts as well. Hudnall responded, quote, we have a copy of the Seacott and Williams and Jackson transcripts. I will be glad to give it to you, end quote. So Hudnall finally gave them a copy of this crucial evidence midway through the trial on February 6, 1924. The trial began on January 29, 1924. Comiskey's lawyers, I am sure, knew that Joe would be discombobulated when confronted with his grand jury testimony. A strategy that I believe would not be, I know would not be permitted in the modern court system because it violates the rules of discovery. So Joe was thrown, denying or saying that he could not remember that what he had testified to before the grand jury in September of 1920. Actually, what Joe did was similar to what Lefty Williams and Eddie Seacott did when they were questioned about their grand jury testimony by Hudnall during their depositions. Like Jackson, they denied participation in the plot to fix the World Series, or said they could not remember, or especially in Seacott's case, refused to answer. Williams insisted, quote, I don't know nothing about throwing the World Series. I can't remember making arrangements to throw the series. I cannot recall getting any $5,000 or giving Jackson $5,000, end quote. The pitcher claimed he could not remember being approached by Gandil outside the Ansonia Hotel in New York City about fixing the World Series, and that he couldn't recall talking to Gandil about the series at all. Seacott also frequently insisted he couldn't remember, saying it was too long ago. He often said he, quote, refused to answer, declaring, I ain't going to answer anything that is going to incriminate me, end quote. While Joe denied his involvement in the fix during his civil trial testimony, he also denied things that were favorable to him, claiming that he didn't go to Comiskey's office the day after the series ended, that he could not remember being asked questions about offering to return to Chicago to tell what he knew during the investigation, that he didn't recall saying he tried to win all the time, that he did not testify that he did not attend meetings with the crooked players. He also said he didn't remember being in an auto accident, which almost ended his career. Williams testified that he couldn't remember saying he did nothing to intentionally throw Game 2, or that he testified he pitched Game 5 and that he had done nothing to throw any game. Seacott even refused to answer that he was married. Both Seacott and Williams testified several times that they did not want to incriminate themselves, Lefty saying, quote, I do not know why I should incriminate myself when I went through that trouble, worried myself half sick. I do not understand law. The law is a funny thing, end quote. Seacott, too, testified, quote, I ain't going to answer anything that is going to incriminate me. When asked by Hudnall, how can it tend to incriminate you? Seacott replied, I don't know. I am no lawyer, end quote. Jacob Pomeranke, commenting on the Catching the Wave podcast, stated, quote, it's over 100 years later and we cannot get into Joe's head, end quote. To understand why Jackson testified as he did when he was cross-examined by Comiskey's attorney about his 1920 grand jury testimony. I disagree. I think we can get inside Joe's head. Like Williams and Seacott, Jackson did not want to admit anything, fearing he might incriminate himself and be charged with some criminal offense. He undoubtedly would agree with Lefty that, quote, the law is a funny thing. That is why I believed he denied so much of his grand jury testimony, fearing that he'd be prosecuted if he admitted it to anything, as Williams and Seacott also feared that. Dr. David Fletcher, interviewed on the podcast Baseball's Untold Story, was asked by the moderator, Sean Dillon, quote, you've testified in medical trials. Joe was charged with perjury because his story changed over 4 years. Hell, if I asked you what you said 4 years ago, would your story change also? Dr. Fletcher replied, obviously, you don't remember everything, but what I do, I review my past testimony, so I make sure I'm consistent with what I said 4 years ago when I'm testifying again. I know damn well that the attorney during the cross-examination is going to have that transcript. He's going to try to impeach me, just like Charles Comiskey's attorney, George Hudnall, did in this case. So it's a real critical aspect of this trial. The fact Joe did change his story from 1920 to what he said on a stand in 1924, end quote. Shoeless Joe and his attorneys were denied the opportunity to review his nearly 3.5-year-old grand jury testimony, which I believe most objective observers would agree was grossly unfair and unjust. Joe, in my opinion, was very likely, he may well have been telling the truth when he said that he couldn't remember his testimony from many years before. Other witnesses who testified at Joe's 1920 civil trial, either on the stand or in their depositions, insisted that they had trouble remembering, Williams asserting, quote, I could not recall the words that were said at that time because since that trouble was over, I've just tried to forget everything and just bury the hatchet. Hudnall asked, what did you try to forget? Lefty responded, everything that happened, what we went through in court, just to forget it and let it go. Seacott, too, testified, quote, I don't remember. That has been too long ago, end quote. When Joe's attorney, Cannon, asked White Sox counsel Alfred Austrian if he had seen Joe's November 1919 letter to Comiskey offering to return to Chicago to tell what he knew, Austrian replied, quote, my memory is not that good, end quote. Comiskey on the stand testified, quote, do you want a man to remember every little thing for years and years and years? End quote. When Lefty was deposed, he claimed, quote, I can't remember what I said in front of the grand jury. Comiskey's attorney responded, no, of course, nobody could testify just what they testified to because it is so long ago. Lefty replied, that stuff had practically left my mind. I forgot it altogether. To which the lawyer responded, naturally so, why naturally so, end quote. Other noteworthy testimony during Joe's civil trial includes that of his wife, Katie, who testified that she saw Lefty Williams give her husband an envelope containing the bribe money. Shoeless Joe's detractors have argued Joe was lying when he said he was angry with Williams and stormed out of the room when Williams offered him the bribe money and told him it was for the use of his name. The key question to me when Katie was deposed was, quote, do you remember where you were when Mr. Williams came into the room, into the hotel room? Katie answered, I was in my room. It was a hotel suite, not a single room. Joe had testified before the grand jury that Katie was in the bathroom when Lefty entered the suite, and Williams said she was either in the bathroom or in her room. I believe, as I explained in part 1 of my video presentation, that Katie was not present when Williams and Jackson had their angry confrontation. Shoeless Joe stormed out of the room and described to his wife what had happened. She returned with Joe and saw the pitcher hand her spouse the dirty envelope with the bribe money and saw Joe put it in his pocket. Jackson admitted when he testified that he had put the envelope in his pocket. He didn't deny that he put the envelope in his pocket. When Alfred Austrian testified at the civil trial, Jackson's attorney tried to get him to admit that he had coached Shoeless Joe about how he should testify before the grand jury. Austrian denied making, quote, any suggestion, end quote, about what he should say. Joe, however, testified Austrian, quote, suggested he tell the grand jury that he was, quote, ashamed of himself. False confession experts say it is a tactic of interrogators to encourage suspects to show remorse. Austrian stated he met with Jackson for 2 hours. Some believe it was closer to 3, and that, quote, Austrian testified that, quote, he was in my office and talking all the time, or I talking to him all the time, end quote. Trying to convince him, I believe, as I explained in part 3 of my video presentation, that it was to his advantage to confess. Joe's attorney asked Austrian question, and you didn't have much trouble getting Jackson to tell about what he knew about the 1919 World Series, did you? Austrian answered, yes, a lot of it, which indicates to me that the ball player's reluctance to go along with Comiskey's attorney's schemes. Austrian admitted he wanted Joe to testify before the grand jury before it adjourned for the day, stating, quote, I was afraid that perhaps someone might get him and change what I considered his then truthful story into an untruthful story. Jackson's lawyer asked, I see. You thought probably he might get a lawyer in Chicago. Is that it? Austrian responded, no, I wasn't afraid of any lawyer if he was an honest one, end quote. I believe he was afraid Joe would get a lawyer who would represent his interests and not one who worked for Comiskey. Austrian also met with Lefty Williams the next day prior to Williams's grand jury testimony. I believe he coached the pitcher to say he gave Joe the bribe money after the 4th game, so their stories matched. Williams, as I mentioned previously, said later in his grand jury testimony that he did not receive, quote, a nickel until the final 2 games, end quote. So if he did not receive any money until after games 7 and 8, the final 2 games, he could not have given Joe the bribe money after game 4. Austrian admitted he met with Comiskey shortly after the 1919 World Series ended, and several times throughout the course of the 5 to 6 month investigation, and intermittently thereafter. He testified that it was his idea to offer a reward for information regarding the rumors about the series. And he encouraged Comiskey to hire the Hunter Detective Agency, with whom his law firm had worked for 20 years. He said, quote, some of the agency reports were sent directly to him. When John Hunter, the owner of the agency, took the stand at the civil trial, he stated he consulted with Austrian extensively during the investigation, and a copy of every report, not just some of the reports, were sent to the White Sox attorney, who he testified told him what procedures he should follow. Comiskey testified that while he knew the World Series was fixed soon after it was over, even meeting with Black Sox players Happy Felsch and Chick Yandel the day after the series ended to discuss the rumors about the fix, and that Shoeless Joe was one of those implicated in the plot. He testified Joe always, quote, played good ball in the series, and that he did not suspect him of any crooked play at any time during his 6-season tenure with the club, end quote. He initially denied on the stand that he had received a letter from Joe in November of 1919 offering to return to tell what he knew, but later admitted he did receive the letter. He also verified Jackson did come to his office the day after the World Series ended, waited an hour, and he did not see him. Comiskey and baseball writer Hugh Fullerton, I believe, falsely testified at the civil trial that they did not discuss the rumors about the fix the morning of Game 1. The White Sox owner testifying that he did not learn about the rumors until the next day before Game 2. He later admitted Hugh Fullerton spoke to him about the fix rumors prior to Game 1, not Game 2. He learned about it before even one pitch had been thrown in the World Series. Harry Graminer, like his boss, initially said that he did not know of and had not seen any letter from Shoeless Joe to Comiskey a month after the series ended, but later admitted he had seen it. He alleged that it had conveniently been, quote, misplaced. The letter was later found and placed in evidence at the civil trial. Graminer denied talking to Jackson about the World Series, but admitted Comiskey had shown him the letter prior to his traveling to Georgia in February of 1920, to try to sign Shoeless Joe to a 3-year contract. During his cross-examination of the grand jury foreman, Henry Brigham, Joe's attorney, James Shaw, questioned him about Joe's offer to, quote, come here last fall in the investigation. I would have told it last fall if they would have brought me in, end quote. Obviously referring to that November 1919 letter. Brigham admitted he made, quote, no inquiry to know what the offer was or to whom he had made the offer, end quote, even though he had the right as jury foreman to ask questions. Regarding Joe's grand jury testimony that Chick Gandil originally offered him $10,000 and Joe said no, and Gandil later offered him $20,000 and Joe again turned him down, Shaw asked Brigham, quote, now did you press him in your questions to find out what happened after that, and if there was any change in his attitude? The jury foreman responded, I don't know that we questioned him, end quote. So Jackson, after testifying that he turned down Gandil's bribe offers twice, was remarkably never asked what changed his mind. Where and when did he tell Gandil that he would join the plot? The conspiracy to throw the World Series. Neither state's attorney Rapogel nor foreman Brigham ever questioned him about it. Brigham admitted Jackson testified that he did not throw any games. When asked if, quote, any attempt was made to investigate Mr. Comiskey's conduct with respect to making or failing to make an investigation, Brigham responded, no, end quote. I believe that had the grand jury known about the letter Joe wrote offering to return to tell what he knew, and his attempt to see the owner to show him the bribe money the day after the series ended, they would have investigated the White Sox owner's conduct, and the Comiskey cover-up would have been exposed. Dr. David Fletcher told podcaster Nestor that Jackson, quote, was guilty. There's no doubt about it. He took the money. When he confessed, he said he always played to win, but he did tell grand jury Judge Charles McDonald, who did testify in his trial, that he didn't always play his hardest during the World Series, end quote. Judge McDonald did testify at the Black Sox criminal trial in 1921 and Joe's civil trial in 1924. He claimed Jackson told him in his chambers prior to his grand jury appearance that, quote, he was first approached by Chick Gandil in New York outside the Anzoni Hotel, who told him he thought he could get him $5,000, and Jackson said that he wouldn't accept $5,000, that wouldn't be sufficient for a common laborer to do a dirty trick of that kind, end quote. At the criminal trial in 1921, McDonald was asked, question, did Jackson tell you that he had played to win in spite of the fact that he had taken the bribe? McDonald answered, quote, he told me he could have played harder, end quote. Joe vehemently denied saying that to the judge. McDonald said that he testified from memory, that he took no notes. It is clear that he is confusing Shoeless Joe with Lefty Williams, who testified before the grand jury the day after Joe testified, that he was approached by Gandil outside the Anzoni Hotel and offered $5,000. He said he told Gandil, quote, that is not enough money for an ordinary working man to do a dirty trick, end quote. When asked, quote, could you have pitched harder in the World Series? Lefty replied, well, I might have pitched harder if I had wanted to, end quote. So it is very clear McDonald got Joe and Lefty confused, and that it was Williams who was approached about throwing the series in New York City by Gandil, and it was Lefty, not Joe, who said that he could have played harder, pitched harder, played harder. In my opinion, nothing McDonald testified about Jackson should be considered, since he is so clearly confusing the two players. Gambler Bill Burns, whose deposition was read at Joe's civil trial, testified Lefty Williams was, quote, kind of representing Jackson. Williams, in his deposition, swore under oath that Joe did not give him permission to use his name and did not know his name was being used to try to get more money out of the gamblers. The jury at Joe's civil trial awarded him $16,711.40 for his back pay. However, Judge Gregory set aside the verdict and charged Jackson with perjury, arguing that the ballplayer either lied during the grand jury testimony in 1920 or during his 1924 civil trial. He stated he believed Joe perjured himself at his civil trial, while those who support Joe believe he falsely confessed when he testified before the grand jury and told the truth at his 1924 civil trial. Gene Carney, the founder of the Sabre Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, commenting on the civil trial transcripts, wrote that there are two camps. The Donald Groffman, who was the author of the book Say It Ain't So Joe camp of Jackson supporters, and the Jerome Holtzman, who had been the official historian for Major League Baseball camp, consisting of Joe's detractors. The Groffman camp believes the transcripts exonerate Joe, while the Holtzman camp, quote, argues they incriminate him, end quote. Carney, while maintaining his neutrality, seemed at times to be leaning toward the Jackson supporters camp, writing, quote, having read the transcripts myself, I must wonder if Holtzman read them at all, end quote. He also wrote, quote, the Milwaukee trials covered differently might have brought about a clamor for Comiskey's resignation, end quote. Tom Cannon, grandson of Joe's attorney Raymond Cannon, and himself a lawyer, speaking at the Black Sox Scandal 85 years later conference held at the Chicago Baseball Museum, asked, why did players walk into the grand jury room and make statements against their own self-interest? Why didn't they have a lawyer? They did have a lawyer. The lawyer was Alfred Austrian, and he happened to be the corporate legal counsel for the Chicago White Sox. He did not explain to the players that he was representing the White Sox as the employer's lawyer, not the employee's lawyer. So all of the players were under the impression that he was their lawyer, while in fact he was representing the Comiskey interests and not the players' interests. End quote. End part 5.